Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much and welcome back tonight to the Rules Committee. The committee will be considering S 2943, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017 for the purpose of advancing to a conference with the Senate, as well as finalizing conference report to accompany S 524, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act of 2016, known as the opioid bill. I wanted to thank two members in particular tonight who are giving up their dinner hour to be with us. The gentleman from Michigan, my big brother, Fred Upton.
Need to thank my wife as well because I
and
left
Amy Upton.
her.
We will thank Amy, and I will remember that. And the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. And I want to thank them both for coming in to testify this evening. Both were most interested in getting our work done, and I appreciate that. I know a lot of hard work has gone into crafting this package, and I know that was done obviously on a basis of including the United States Senate. So without objection, anything you both have in writing for the record, we'll enter that. Before I acknowledge you, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield to the gentlewoman, Mrs. Slaughter, for any opening statements you'd like to make. The gentlewoman's recognized.
That's me.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. It's really lovely to have both of you up here in a balmy summer evening to look at this report. I'm anxious to hear Frank's opinion. I'm hearing grumblings, I don't know if it's true or not, that there's no money in the bill at all to make it possible for the bill to survive. I'm very interested in hearing how you're going to do that, Fred. That's going to be a pretty good trick. So I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I know that was helpful.
Mr. Chairman, you're not you're an authorizer, not an appropriator. You're the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we're delighted that you're here. The gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to submit my statement for the record.
Thank you.
I just want to say that we had what I thought was a very good conference today. Actually, the first conference that I've chaired in the 6 years that I've been chairman. I've served on a couple of different conferences on other committees, but it's the first one that I chaired. Some of us forgot that we had this thing called proxy voting, which ended in the House in 1994, and so both of us, both Mr. Pallone and I, used proxy voting, and it worked out pretty well, at least from my perspective. And we had one prominent, respected Democrat who wanted a parliamentary inquiry because he had not, I don't know that he was here in 1994. He was, but yeah, but it worked well. I just want to say that the two sides, House and Senate, I thought worked well together. We had a number of amendments that were 15, I want to say maybe 13 amendments at the end of the day. 16 were submitted. I think 12 or 13 were offered, of which 4 or 5 were adopted by both sides on voice votes. It's a better bill than it was before. To the gentlelady's concerns about money, you'll remember that it was in neither the House or Senate bill. We're not appropriators. My sense is that at the end of the day, before the bill gets to the president, we'll find some money for it. I think there's a couple of ways to do it, but that wasn't our purpose today, which is why it's not in there. But at the end, I want to say every Republican signed the conference report. And at the end, I don't think any of the Democrats signed it because of that. But I'm optimistic that, in fact, we'll pull the rabbit out of the hat and the president can sign the bill when the process gets complete. But the next step is to pass it in the House, which is why I'm here today. And I would urge you all to let us move forward so that we can take this up perhaps as early as Friday. And I yield back. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Pallone, welcome. We're delighted that you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of Fred Upton, I will just submit my official statement as well, and then just kind of summarize along the same lines that he's put forth, although I disagree. I guess the problem from my perspective is that the opiate heroin crisis is an epidemic. We all recognize that. I know in my statement I say that every day 78 Americans lose their fight against this epidemic. And, the victims are old and young, rich and poor, across every ethnic and racial composition that you can imagine. So there was an effort, I think, made on a bipartisan basis to address those concerns. And, there are things in the bill, I'll just mention two. For example, there's a provision that may not seem important, but it actually is, that says that if you go to a pharmacy and you agree, you give permission, that the pharmacist doesn't have to fill your prescription completely. He can give you half of it, for example. And the reason for that, and the reason that's important, is we find out that a lot of times if there's an extra, pills in the bottle, people in the family or friends will end up taking those painkillers, and that leads to addiction. So, that's an important thing. There's another provision, which I think I mentioned in my opening statement, that deals with allowing nurse practitioners and physician assistants to treat individuals with BUP, which is a substitute, if you will, for opiates that, helps people because it's not as addictive. So I'm not suggesting that there aren't some good things in here. In fact, when it comes to the substance and issues that are not funding related, we agree for the most part. But the real problem is that when I go home, and this goes to Ms. Slaughter's comments, when I go home, the only thing that the people that I know, whether they're in treatment centers or the police or they're the mayors or the state legislators, talk about is the lack of resources. They lack of resources for treatment, lack of resources for prevention, lack of resources for overnight stays. And so I strongly feel that if we're not providing any funding, and I would say, that's not only, obviously I'd like to see some kind of mandatory funding in here, but even in terms of the authorizations, that without some kind of actual commitment of funds, I would like to see mandatory funding, which we can do in our committee. I just think that we're kind of masking the reality here. In other words, we're really not doing much. If the problem is 100%, maybe we're dealing with 5%. And I'm not suggesting that 5% that deals with things like, the partial fill is not important, because it is. But it only addresses 5% because that's what we really need is significant resources. So that is the reason that we, as Democrats, refused to sign the conference report. And we had an amendment, which I sponsored in the committee today, that would have provided, I think, $920 million in funding. And we had offsets that we've used on a bipartisan basis for other things over this session of Congress. So that's the gist of it. I totally agree with Ms. Slaughter. And we're not just making this up. The president, I think, requested over $1 billion because of the recognition that the funding at the federal level is the key. So I don't know what else to say. At this point, I cannot support the conference report because I don't think we've addressed the funding. Now, I love, I really do like Chairman Upton quite a bit. I'm serious about that. And he's the ultimate optimist. So, of course, he came here and he said, we're going to find a way to provide the money. And I'm sure he'll give you all different ways that that's going to happen, the appropriators, whatever, before we get, before this gets signed into law or after it gets signed into law. But he's too much of an optimist, because the reality is that unless there's some guarantee, which there isn't, that we're going to get this funding, I think it's very possible that this bill goes to the president's desk as is. The funding is not there, and then we'll see whether or not the appropriators actually come up with the money. And even if they do, it wouldn't be until the next fiscal year. And this is a crisis that's with us now. So I just don't think it's adequate. It's that simple. Thank you.
The problem is enormous. And I don't claim, except by watching TV and talking occasionally or hearing things about the problem. The problem is exacerbated because it is now an easy fix. You take a little pill. You don't have to cook a rock and shoot it in your veins. It's relatively difficult for a family necessarily to know that you're popping a pill. Its long-term effects are not that you're flying high, you're flying with a depressant. But that after a long period of time, I don't know that, whether it's a week or 2 or 6 weeks, you can't sleep. So you then take what might be, I guess I would call it a barbiturate or a sleeping pill, something that then causes you to quit breathing. The enormous or the enormity of this on families and the enormous problem can happen because you go in for something as simple as surgery or dental work. I did not hear about this from the federal government. I heard about this from National Geographic Drugs, Inc., which is a TV show. And maybe it's a silent, or maybe it was a silent epidemic that families are struggling with. But I think lots of families are struggling with it. I think lots of people are struggling. So it's my hope that we will take whatever is here, that the president would use this as a stepping stone, and it would be my guess that we should find a way to not only understand the issue and to fund it, but to provide grants that are available. And I think a grant piece is in here. But this term that I think is naloxone is a inhalant, as I understand it, that is available that can save people and the first responders when they find someone who is evidently in trouble. They can give them this without any side effects and save them. So I think it's also upon all of us as elected officials and as others to know the facts of the case. I'm telling you what I think are facts of the case. I'm neither a medical person nor am I trained in this area, but I'm trying to know more about this. So it's my hope that the Energy and Commerce Committee could really highlight these things and maybe provide informational benefits to people to know more about them, and that we could all, as advocates, as members of Congress, put well thought through information out on our channels. So that is not in the bill. That is just one member of Congress who is recognizing this. We saw Prince, who evidently died of this. We have seen others. We know we have a raging heroin epidemic in this country. We know we have a terrible marijuana problem, and yet states still go to these new efforts to make it easier. We have people that petition us every day for a drug society, and we forget the downsides of this. It is some 50,000 people a year die in the United States of America of some sort of a drug overdose. And I'm concerned about it and worried about it, and I have college-age students, and I know the American people are struggling. So I will say to you, I'm thankful, Mr. Chairman, that you looked at this in detail, that you've come up with the best that you can, and it's my hope that it works to the benefit of people who are struggling to do better.
Mr. Chairman, I know that Hal Rogers is watching me here. And as much as we as on Energy and Commerce would like to have the appropriations process under our elbows, we don't have that authority. Sorry, Hal. Congratulations to you. But we are able to authorize, and that's what we did in this bill. So as an example, I would just note that the bill funds SAMHSA at $4.2 billion, which is $431 million above the enacted level and $480 million above the president's request. We're not allowed to appropriate money. We can only authorize. Now, I want to work with the appropriators. I do want to find a way. I want to find a way that the appropriators can have a key to that box to help our states deal with this issue. It's important, and I think, though that's not likely to happen before the end of this week, because it won't, I think that there's a decent chance, I really do, that before this bill gets to the president, that money will be there that all of us could support that will help the families in dire need. But that's just, we're not prepared to do that this week, and that's not within the authorization. I mean, we're not allowed under House rules to appropriate under on an authorization bill. You cannot do that, and vice versa. So, but at the end of the day, maybe next week, we can get this done. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, obviously, our committee has, in the past, provided mandatory funding, and we have the offsets that we mentioned, that are within the committee's jurisdiction as part of that $920 million that I mentioned that we had as an amendment today. I didn't specify all of them because I didn't think you really wanted to hear it, but we actually have the offsets that we mentioned today. And it is possible, obviously, for the committee to include that kind of mandatory funding with offsets under the Republican rules from within the committee's jurisdiction, and we were prepared to do that. So I understand what he's saying, that we're not appropriators, but we obviously have in the past. We did it with 21st Century Cures, for example, that we provided mandatory funding and provided the offsets. I mean, the problem now, is the appropriations process. There's no emergency appropriations, so at best, we're talking about some kind of CR or omnibus at the end of the year. And that's another 6 months without any significant funding to deal with this problem.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and advise somebody what they should do, but I would say that we are 6 months into it, and I would hope that somebody could find some money, even if it's within the administration. As you recall, a couple of years ago, the president found at the end of fiscal cycle over $400 million out of Homeland Security to fund the needs of 60,000 children that came to this country. So I want to thank both of you for your very sobering work and for being with us tonight. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership. I, without objection, will enter into the record a summary of the House and Senate conference report on S-524 that I'm going to make sure is in the record and it's provided by the committee. Without objection, we'll do that. Mrs. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our colleagues for being here. I echo much of what you have brought up tonight. I don't think it's necessary to repeat those comments, but just say that I appreciate the hard work and the attention that that this report has gotten. I think the overwhelming support that the bills got, that when we passed individual bills, was an indication of how all across this country people are concerned about this issue. And the bills that we passed did get strong bipartisan support, and I don't understand why this wouldn't also. So I thank you, and I have no questions. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter?
Thank you. I appreciate both of you, and I've known you for a long time, and you do extraordinary work. But this is kind of unusual time. Everything that I understand is we're not going to see another appropriations bill. We're going to go into omnibus bill. And
Well,
given
we're
the
doing
fact,
one now. Aren't we doing one now on the floor?
we've had some problems, and everything I read, I could be totally wrong about it, and we'll pass them all before October 1st. Fat chance, right? Okay. So since this is an emergency and you can mandate some money, I would just hate to go back. I do, Frank, the Northeast right now, as we understand, really is where the epidemic is worse. And like you, I get asked all the time, what are we going to do about this? And I like what you've done about overprescriptions, that people, to give a whole bottle of OxyContin for tooth extraction, I think is a bit much, and I think that's part of the problem. But it's serious, and I guess like we do with most things here, we'll just try to hope for the best. Everything seems to be totally out of our control, but thank you all for your work.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel like folks have their heads hung kind of low. I'm going to try to channel my inner Upton optimism here. I'm number one, delighted by the example you all are setting of submitting the written statement for the record, and if we could get other folks to follow that example, we'll be in better shape here on the committee. But if we can get folks to follow the example of working this out, how disappointing it is. I've been here 5.5 years. I've never seen a labor HHS appropriations bill. And for my Democratic colleagues like Mr. Polis, who got here before me, he's never seen a labor HHS appropriations bill. I mean, what? Come on. I mean, these were serious issues that you all had to sit down and work out together, not just amongst yourself, but with the Senate, and you did it in authorizing fashion. I often, I wonder right now if the cardinal of the Labor HHS committee isn't working right now to find the funding on this bill. But I hear my appropriators often say, for Pete's sakes, we're getting our job done. Why aren't the authorizers doing their work? I think that's a fair criticism in many cases. I think it is a wonderful opportunity for something that has brought the Congress together, as your language has, to say, for Pete's sakes, why can't we get our appropriations work done at the same time? I would ask Mr. Pallone. I'm glad the mandatory spending didn't end up in here. I look forward to supporting the bill. I likely would not have if we'd gone and started a new mandatory spending program. It's supposed to be critically examined year after year and plussed up as the crisis expands. I was just in Colombia. We've interdicted 50% more cocaine in the first half of this year than we did last year, not because we're better at it, but because there's twice as much of it out there as there is. The crisis is getting worse. We need to be able to plus it up. Is it a role of a Congress issue that you just deeply believe it should have been mandatory, a spending program, and the committee should not be dependent upon the appropriators to handle their half of the job? Or is it that you've seen the last 8 years of Democrat and Republican control too, and you just don't believe we're going to get to appropriations bills, and so it's not going to happen?
Well, I think it's a combination. I mean, it's the fact that it is an immediate crisis, as Ms. Saunders said, and it's not likely that we see any kind of appropriations until I think lame duck. Most likely scenario. So you're talking 6 months down the road. And the fact of the matter is, that when I talk to people at home, this is anecdotal. It's all about money. I mean, in other words, they just feel that if they're going to do treatment, prevention, various education programs, whatever, that they're just lacking resources. And so as much as I agree with the substance of what we've come up with here today, I mean, we worked on it on a bipartisan basis, and we came up with a good bill. It just, I think, it only addresses, like I said, maybe 5% of the epidemic. As much as the partial fill is a good thing, and I'm not suggesting it isn't, I've talked about it quite a bit, I just don't think that's going to really address the problem in a meaningful way unless we have some real resources here. Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned that we're not going to get the funding certainly for, another 6 months, and that it may not be sufficient based on, the past experience.
I'm not sure when you arrived in Congress.
Oh, no, I've been here when we did do bills.
And if it were that year, instead of this year, would we see names on the conference report? Would we see a celebration instead of heads hanging low, and then would we be moving on to the appropriation cycle?
I mean, I can't remember exactly, but we actually used to do some of the appropriation bills well before. We would do them like this time of year, or even earlier. They
Oh,
would
they've
be
been done in January
Yeah.
by you guys.
In other words, we would have appropriation bills in place by now for the next fiscal year. Sure. In the old days.
Well, that sounds like the note of
But there was a
optimism.
stimulus package of $800 billion.
Focusing on those things that unite us rather than divide us. I appreciate what you all have done. I look forward to voting in favor of it on the floor, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here, and again, there's really not much that's objectionable in the underlying bill, other than the issue that Mr. Pallone raised about the lack of funding. I mean, I think many of us voted to move the process forward, but by this time, I think we had hoped that there would have been some immediate funding request, given the fact that this is an epidemic, and I have been to many funerals in my district. I have been to, parent counseling sessions with parents whose kids are going through this terrible addiction. I have talked to people who are going through detox, who have got out of detox, who are trying to find places to recover, and there's nothing available. So this is not something that. I mean, for those of us who have been involved in this issue back in our districts, this is not something that we can go back and tell parents, well, maybe next year there'll be some money. And maybe next year we'll be able to help fund these good ideas that we all talked about. And I think there is a concern, and I'll be very honest, given the strict limits on the appropriations bills that my friends have put in place, that whatever comes forward, and it won't be through a regular HHS appropriations bill, it will be through an omnibus bill, will be significantly less than is needed, and would underfund a lot of the ideas that you have put forward. So I think that's just the frustration, and but that's where the frustration is, because quite frankly, I don't believe we're going to fund this at the level that we all think it should be funded, and we need something right now. We need something. We need to do something yesterday, and if we don't fund this, then it adds up to be nothing more than a press release, and I would think that would be a terrible tragedy. So I hope your optimism pays off, and the money that we all believe is sufficient comes. But this is an epidemic that you can't nickel and dime. It really isn't. We're losing too many lives, and it is a crisis. And so I thank you for your Mr. Chairman for your work on this. Again, I voted to advance the process, but I'm at the point where I want to seeing is believing, and unless I see the money, I don't believe it's going to come, at least not in the amount that, quite frankly, is necessary to confront this crisis nationally. So I thank you both for being here. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many days I consider myself one of the luckiest members of Congress. I get to spend my mornings in hearings in the Energy and Commerce Committee and my evenings in hearings in the Rules Committee. And the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Chairman, I've lost count. We passed a mental health bill today. What are the successes of the Energy and Commerce Committee? You frequently delineate them to us, but how many bills have we sent to the floor?
Your time would be expired by the time that I finished, but we have had nearly 50 provisions signed into law in this Congress. We've passed more than 100 bills on the House floor. I dare say that I think all but one has been bipartisan. From your bill, H.R. 2, which was the dock fix, to pipeline safety the President signed 2 weeks ago, to TSCA, to cures, and we're getting close on that, to this bill again, a major conference, a whole slew of bills. The list is long, and you've been a good part of all of them as has Mr. Pallone and others, as we've moved bills through the committee. And it was actually nice, today we celebrated John Nichols' 90th birthday. And he taught us all how to work the process, to obey the rules and to move the ball forward. And it's always better when you're on the same side. And I think we have a pretty good track record, better than any other committee in terms of moving bills on the House floor that are bipartisan. And we've worked well with not only with our Senate colleagues, but also with the White House, because they wouldn't move. They wouldn't be signing into law without the president's support.
And, everyone decries the fact that, Congress is dysfunctional and not working, but really the Energy and Commerce Committee it's where it gets done. And,
We
congratulations
want
to
catfish
both of you.
back. We want catfish back.
Oh,
Little inside joke.
but, really, credit to the chairman and the ranking member of the committee, because, these bills do pass after our.
Microbeads, that's a big bill. I'm not to disagree. Oil spill legislation, whole slew of things.
Now, one of the frustrations I have, every term I try to go out to the National Institute of Health. Sometimes I'll go down to the Center for Disease Control, and they always love to show me their beautiful campus and all their beautiful buildings. And, I'm an authorizer. I've sat on an authorizing committee with you, Mr. Chairman, with you, Mr. Ranking Member, so I'm an authorizer, and I realize that the work is done in the authorizing committee. But the checks are written at the Appropriations Committee. So when you go and look at all these beautiful buildings at the National Institute of Health and CDC, they're all named for appropriators. I've never been in a building named for an authorizer. Have you, Mr. Chairman?
No,
No, they don't exist.
not even a post office.
So we do labor sometimes in obscurity, but we actually provide the groundwork that allows the appropriators then to have buildings named in their honor. Sometimes it seems like a thankless task. I do want to ask you one thing, because and I have been through the hearings, and we've done a lot of hearings. We've done a lot of hearings in the committee, and I thank you for that. I think this issue has been well studied by the authorizing committee. One of the frustrations when I look at it from a physician's perspective, I remember 10 years ago, I think it was calendar year 2005, and we had a big hearing in Energy and Commerce about how pain management was not being met satisfactorily. We were critical of doctors because they weren't prescribing satisfactory pain relief, and in fact, pain became a vital sign, and it had to be asked about. I want our doctors to do the right thing. I want us to give them the tools to be able to do the right thing. And in my opinion, and one of the things that I'm grateful to see in this bill is the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, the NASPR program that you are reauthorizing in this bill. My question to you, though, is there's always been a disconnect between the authorizers and the appropriators on the funding for this Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. Do you have a sense as to, and I realize that you're concerned about the chairman of the Appropriations Committee watching this hearing, but do you have a sense as to that we're resolving this conflict?
If I could comment on it, again, I don't know what's going to happen this year, and obviously I'm very suspect based on what I've said, but NASPR, for the most part, has not been funded. It's been funded at some years with no money, other years with very minimal. So, I actually sponsored the NASPR legislation, 20 years ago. For the most part, the appropriators have not funded them.
I wish Mr. Cole was, I know he's watching, but he just this morning unveiled his labor age bill. Now, of course, it has to go through the committee and ultimately likely through a CR process. We're not expecting it to get to the House floor, unlike the days when we had Bill Natcher here and other giants, Sylvia O'Connor, where all those buildings are named after. But I'm led to believe that there is adequate funding within that appropriation bill for that program. And Mr. Cole, who would normally sit right here in front of me, I think would be nodding his head in support of that. But again, at the end of the day, and I know Mr. McGovern, I got to believe, is a Red Sox fan. I'm a Cubs fan, and we're both optimists, and someday, maybe this year, the two shall meet.
So Dr. Burgess, NASPR is a perfect example where over the last 15 or 20 years, however it's been authorized, there have been many years when there's been no funding at all. So
there's
if that's not a good...
Reclaiming my time, there's a competing program that gets funded by the appropriators. And here's the thing, from a physician's perspective, I just want the data. I want to be able to do a good job for my patient who is in pain and in extremis and has called upon me for help. That's what I've profession that I've chosen to follow, and I want to be able to help that patient. At the same time, I don't want to contribute to the problem by prescribing drugs that are going to be diverted, that are duplicative, that are the 60th prescription that patient has that week. I would like to be able to query a database to know what is the prescribing history that has followed that patient, and to do so in a way that doesn't violate HIPAA. And I believe the prescription drug monitoring program that our committee has authorized, I agree with you. I think it is a good, solid program, and it's a tool that I want to give our practitioners, our providers, our doctors, so that they can practice their art and alleviate suffering when they're called upon to do so, and not further contribute to the problem, which all of us would agree we want to see solved.
And if I could add, I agree with you completely. The alternative program, which has been funded, is more of a law enforcement, criminal enforcement program.
Correct.
It doesn't serve the same purpose.
That's correct. And yes, I would agree that you've got to be able to drive out fear if it's going to be successful, and that means it should not be a law enforcement program. It should be a data monitoring program. I'm fully supportive of what the Energy and Commerce Committee has done with this over the tenure that I've been on the committee, the last 10 or 11 years. But again, I thank the chairman. We had a lot of hearings. We had a lot of testimony. We heard from a lot of people. Mr. Chairman, we actually combined, how many different bills were combined to make this
Well, we
base
had
bill?
19 bills, I think, on the House floor, but within that, we had a lot of bills within the committee that we packaged together.
So this was a fulsome process, and members
From both sides of the aisle.
were heard from on their priorities and getting their issues addressed. So thanks to all the labor that you've put into it. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that you chaired a conference committee. I will tell you, in my tenure in Congress, I've never been on a conference committee. I've heard about them.
You had
I've
a
read about
chance
them.
once.
I've read about them, but I have never actually served on a conference
Will
committee.
the gentleman yield for a point of clarification?
Yes.
Yeah, the gentleman mentioned that he didn't know of any authorizers whose names are on buildings, only appropriators. So I just Googled John Dingle buildings. And I got
Yeah.
the John Dingle VA Medical Building, the John Dingle Transit Building, the John Dingle Community Conference Center, and I stopped
Are
Googling
they all at
after
the
that.
NIH, or are they in Michigan?
Yeah, there's hope for authorizers. Maybe even hope for
Yeah.
people on Rules Committee someday.
Never recognized at our own time. I think, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the
Chairman
time.
yields back his time. You know, maybe Michigan will name their football stadium Upton Stadium.
I
or
know,
something.
we like the big house the way it
Oh,
is.
the big house like that, the way it is. Mr. Polis, gentleman does not seek time. The gentleman from Alabama, the gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I just had a couple of questions. First of all, thank you for your hard work and a successful conference committee, it sounds like, but you brought up a point in your testimony, Mr. Chairman, about some improvements that were made. 13 or 15 or 16 amendments were offered, 4 were accepted, I believe, 4 or 5. I'm just curious, at what points of improvement did you come to in conferences?
They
Mr.
involved,
Chairman?
we had some bills on veterans. We had a Sheila Jackson Lee amendment. There was a good amendment that an emphasis focused on treatment rather than incarceration. She worked with both sides, so that it was accepted on a voice vote. I want to say all the amendments, at least at the end, one side or the other accepted it by voice, because of course at a conference, we had House amendments and Senate amendments, and if one body pushed for an amendment, and there were some particularly from the Senate, that even though the count was 4 Republicans on the conference committee and 3 Democrats, there were a number of Democrat amendments that passed, either on a voice vote or on a recorded vote, that were then accepted. Some of the, I think 1 or 2 were accepted on the House side and vice versa. But I thought the bill, as it moved, you know, the bill was, you know, we offered amendments. People had to file them by 6 o'clock last night. 16 amendments filed, 12 or 13 offered. A couple were offered and withdrawn. 1 was on medical or on marijuana. But Mr. Cohen from Tennessee withdrew both amendments. But at the end, I think we had a better bill, and they went by voice. And so
I just thought it would be important to learn what those were, never having been on a conference committee myself either. I hope I don't have to wait 10 years to do that. But and also encouraged to hear that there were some additions to address veterans' issues. In the original language, there was, I thought, some good language to address some issues at VA facilities of overprescription and some.
Yep. And those were, some of those bills were separate provisions that we passed. Gus Bilirakis had a bill that was adopted on the House floor as part of the, I want to say, 19 different bills that we had. And of course,
Right.
he serves on our committee as well as veterans, so he was very appreciative of that. And again, it was a solid bipartisan vote. I mean, I want to say it was over 400 votes when we took that up
Right.
on the House floor. Very important, particularly as it relates to training for veterans who may be overseas, and they may be, in their day-to-day routine, and, when they come back, they still want to be licensed by their respective states, and that training ought to count, and they shouldn't have to go back to square one. So it was, again, strongly bipartisan in every way, which was why, at the end of the day, when the bills were packaged together on the House floor back in the end of April, beginning of May, I think we had 404 votes for the entire package.
Which I think, and Mr. Chairman, that speaks highly of the strength and the feeling of this body, and I think has to have some impact on the appropriators process. So I share your optimism, but will do what I can to help.
Well, I'd like
help
to
that
just say
process
this, if I might just ask, so at the end, if we're able to get where I think we are able to go, I'd like to think that maybe we'll get some extra time on the House floor from this committee to talk about all the good things that we've done that will clearly be bipartisan, because we'll have a lot of people wanting to be in that line, wanting to speak in terms of what we're doing for the American public.
I appreciate that. Thank you both, Mr. Pallone and Mr. Upton. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say thank you to the chairman and the ranking member for their hard work on this issue. And while this bill certainly doesn't do everything, because the money has to be appropriated, there's some incredible stuff in this bill. And I just wanted to add my voice to the folks saying thank you. I was a little troubled when the gentleman from New Jersey insinuated that partial fill won't do much, because I will tell you, as one of the co-sponsors of that with Catherine Clark out of Massachusetts, 70% of the people who abuse opioids find their opioids in their friends' and neighbors' medicine cabinets. So I was just a little disturbed that was run down as if it doesn't do much, because 70% of the people bridge their opioid addiction through medicine cabinets of unused prescriptions, and partial fill is a piece of the puzzle that can help fix that. So, and I know you didn't mean to run it down, but it struck a nerve with me as one of the main sponsors of that bill, because it's really an important piece that can help us break the bridge to addiction, because most people won't go from abusing a few pills to injecting themselves with heroin, and they get a bridge there was a lady who got a bridge for 2 years. She would go to real estate open houses, and she would go into their medicine cabinets, and this was on 60 Minutes, and she would steal the pills out of the people's medicine cabinets every Saturday and Sunday. She'd go to 4 or 5 real estate open houses just to feed her addiction. She did it for 2 years until she got so desperate she went to the point that she was willing to shoot herself with heroin. So, I'm sure the gentleman didn't mean to run down that provision, because it is a very important and helpful provision. It's not a total silver bullet. It is a piece to a very complicated puzzle. There are a lot of other great pieces in here. Appreciate what you've both done to help with veterans courts. Appreciate what you've done for treatment in here. And the only thing I see missing in here is the gentleman from West Virginia has a piece of legislation, Mr. Mooney, which would end the practice of allowing drug-seeking people to fill out a questionnaire at a hospital and say whether their pain was managed or not. I do think that is something we have to address as a as a body and as a country, because while I want people's pain to be managed, it really allows drug-seeking people to grade down the hospital or institution, and therefore allows it encourages doctors to overprescribe. And we are 300 million people in a world of almost 4 billion people, so we're less than 10% of the world's population, and we use 90% of the world's opioids. So,
Let me just
the-
point out,
the
as-
gentleman from,
as-
I recognize the chairman.
As it relates to that last provision, the administration, I'm told, just yesterday tried to fix that problem administratively. So that's-
Oh, good, I'm glad to hear that. I did not know
Good
that HHS has had the power to fix it,
and
I believe.
As much as we'd like to do it, I think it is a Ways and Means issue. We did have Ways and Means.
Oh, okay,
conferees.
that may be a Ways and Means.
We'll take their jurisdiction too, Mr. Brady.
Well, I hate it when petty jurisdictional issues get in the way of solving problems, but I also understand that jurisdiction's important. And so I appreciate that the administration did take some steps to ease that, because it's a very complicated puzzle. You've solved a bunch of the pieces here. There's more things to do. And I just want to thank both of you for your work, your committee's work, including the doctor from Texas here, the great OBGYN doc that serves with us on the Rules Committee too. So thank you for sending us this, and we've got more work to do because we do have to fund it. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you not only for your time in conference and the extreme amount of time that you've spent on this, but also your confidence that we can bring this to the floor and explain it properly to people. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. I texted Amy and told her you did a great job,
I
Fred.
should have brought her up, but I sent her home.
I reminded her how awesome you are, so good luck. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. This now closes the hearing portion of the conference report to accompany S-524. Chairman now be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant a rule providing for consideration of the conference report to accompany S-524, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act of 2016. The rule waives all points of order against the conference report and against its consideration. The rule provides that the conference report shall be considered as read. The rule provides that the previous question shall be considered as ordered without intervention of any motion except 1 hour debate and 1 motion to recommit if applicable. Section 2 of the rule provides that the House has taken S-2943, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017, from the Speaker's table, adopts an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of H.R. 4909 as passed by the House, and adopts S-2943 as amended. Finally, the rule provides that the chair of the Committee on Armed Services or his designee is authorized to move that the House insist on its amendments to S-2943 and request a conference with the Senate thereon.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
Yes.
Gentlewoman from New York's recognized.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry that the chair and the ranking member are gone, but maybe we can remind them that the Rules Committee is all-powerful. And we can do anything in the world up here.
I think we're going to start
And,
with Mike Burgess first.
Okay. But on 9 separate occasions during this Congress alone, we've waived the rule to prohibit appropriating on authorizing bills on 9 separate occasions. So if they had thought it important enough to put some money in this bill, they could have asked for a waiver. And some of us think that the opioid epidemic does require that, but I really want to just put that down on the record. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the conference report from the motion from the gentlewoman. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Roll call, please.
Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Stivers? Aye. Mr. Stivers votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse votes aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter votes no. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern votes no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne, will be handling this for Republicans,
And Mr. Polis for Democrats.
and Mr. Polis for Democrats.
Mr. Chairman, do you
Yes, ma'am.
expect we'll have any more meetings this week?
At this moment, we do not have another meeting scheduled this week. However, it would not surprise me if we did make a change to that. But right now, we're not scheduled. We've now done the conference.
We're free for the rest of the evening, in other words.
And we are free for the rest of the evening. Thank you very much. Oh, that's right, there will be votes on the floor.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This completes our work for the week.